winning an NBA championship almost always requires a strong duo to do so. Although over the course of NBA history, you've had teams like the '94 Rockets, led by Hakeem Olajuwon, the 2011 Dallas Mavericks, led by Dirk, who were able to win an NBA championship led by one superstar and competent role players. That video will be coming in the near future. But for the most part, generally speaking, you need a very strong first option and second option to secure an NBA title. Now, when ranking all-time players, it gets difficult because when you rank based on accolades, the order is going to be different than when you rank off talent. For example, Scottie Pippen has 6 championships to LeBron James's 3, but most of us would agree that LeBron is more talented than Scottie Pippen. When ranking players all time and making lists such as these, I've determined the best way to do so is by using a combination of 3 things: longevity, accolades, and talent. When looking at longevity, you look at how long the 2 players were teammates. When assessing accolades, of course, you look at NBA championships, but you also look at everything between all-star appearances and all NBA selections while they were teammates. When assessing talent, you look at the level that each player was at when they were playing together. I'm Tricon, and this is Unpopular Facts. Before we get started, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell. Only takes 2 seconds and it helps out more than you may know. We're going to go ahead and start out with the honorable mentions here. These are teams that played before the NBA-ABA merger in the mid-70s. It's just harder to rank teams that played in the 60s and early 70s and even the 50s. It's just harder to rank them. Like Bill Russell, in his era, there were only 11 teams in the league. Even though he won every championship of the 60s except one, it's just harder to rank them. But starting out, we'll start out with John Havlicek and Bill Russell. Like I said, won every single championship of the 60s, but one. There were only 11 teams in the league, but it's worth noting that he went up against one of the most unstoppable forces of all time in Wilt Chamberlain. So he had the success, and Wilt Chamberlain had the individual success. So team success versus individual success, I think we can argue that we take team success. So Bill Russell and Havlicek first. Havlicek, one of the better defenders of all time, one of the most underrated players of all time, a Celtics great. Like I said, did so much damage and pretty much defined prehistoric basketball, the prehistoric basketball era. Second is going to be Russell and Cousy. Bob Cousy, one of the better defenders of all time, known, if they recorded steals back then, it's worth noting that he would probably be amongst, the all-time leader in steals if they recorded steals back then. Like I said, did so much damage in the 60s and late 50s. Next is going to be Willis Reed and Walt Frazier. These guys pretty much are the best Knicks of all time. That includes Patrick Ewing. New York is the mecca of basketball. They are the only duo to ever bring a championship to New York. That's the 73 and 70 championship. These two have a total of 11 All-Star appearances together. Willis Reed was the 1970 MVP. We all, if you look back in time and look at archives, you remember Willis Reed when he came back, after hurting his leg or whatever, came back and, won the NBA Finals. So Walt and Willis, one of the better duos of all time. And next is going to be one of my favorite, really, is West and Baylor. You could have went West and Chamberlain here, but West and Baylor played their entire careers together. I may even say, probably even West and Chamberlain. Yeah, West and Chamberlain could have went here because they actually won a title together. But Jerry West and Elgin Baylor were one of the greatest 1-2 punches of all time. But being in that prehistoric era is just hard to rank them. Even though they are the pioneers, it just kind of sucks that, there were only 10, 11 teams in the league when they were playing. Coming in at number 10 is going to be Steph and KD. All right. I could have went Steph and Clay here, but I ultimately decided in 2015, if it wasn't for Kevin Love and Kyrie getting hurt, the Golden State Warriors would not have won the championship in 2015. So that's why I'm going with Steph and KD here. Probably one of the more offensively sound duos on this list and of all time. They only played together 3 seasons. That's why they're so low on the list. But, you know, when KD joined the Warriors, I mean, you know, they overpowered the league to the point where, you know, teams were just waiting for them to fall apart. That was the only way that this duo could fail. And it's the only way that they did fail. You know, in 2019, when they did lose, obviously KD got hurt. But during that run, during those 3 seasons, they both were in their prime, both elite shooters, both all NBA players. So Steph and KD, number 10. Coming in at number 9 is going to be Karl Malone and John Stockton. These are the only 2 on this list that don't have an NBA championship. And you may wonder why they rank above Steph and KD, but like I said, longevity matters, and they also played in the era with Jordan. But you know, you talk about, I think it was 16, 17, 18 seasons, however, I mean, it was from Karl Malone came to the league in 85, and he left for the Lakers in 03, so 18 years together. So and you know, a lot of playoff appearances, no championships, but 2 finals appearances. One of the more iconic duos of all time. Legendary pick and roll, legendary coach with Jerry Sloan. You know, pretty much a shame they couldn't win the title together, but just, I mean, in terms of just status, you can't mention Stockton without Malone, and you can't mention Malone without Stockton. So one of the more iconic duos of all time. Like I said, Karl Malone, one of the best power forwards. I think he was the best power forward for most of his career after Charles Barkley, and you know, especially in the early 90s. It was after Charles Barkley MVP in 93, but after that I think it was Karl Malone for the better part of 10 years. John Stockton, don't know if I could ever call him the best point guard in the league. I think maybe in the early 90s he was the best point guard after Magic left. But Stockton, of course, all-time steals leader, all-time assist leader, and I don't think anyone's catching him in assist. So Stockton and Malone, number 9. Coming in at number 8 is going to be LeBron James and Dwayne Wade. Of course, they only played 4 seasons together. We thought it would be a lot more than that. You know, you remember the famous press conference, not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6. Ended up only being 2 championships in 4 seasons. They did have 4 finals appearances, which is an accomplishment. But, you know, like I said, they shouldn't have lost to the 2010-2011 Dallas Mavericks. I think that was probably one of the most disappointing finals losses in LeBron's career, and of course in that era. So, but both of them were in their primes in the early part. You know, D Wade started getting injured. You know, had a couple nagging injuries that kind of weakened that duo some, but they come in at number 8 simply because of the accolades and the talent, and you know, not a lot of longevity. Of course, only 4 seasons. I think, you know, they did play together for a short time in Cleveland, but you know, we're throwing that out. So number 8, LeBron James and Dwayne Wade. Coming in at number 7 is going to be Tim Duncan and Manu Ginobili. 7 on up, it gets a lot harder to rank them. But like I said, when you go off longevity, accolades, and talent, I don't think you can go wrong. But yeah, 1 through 7, you got more accomplished duos. They, you know, more longevity and of course more talent. So, but number 7 is going to be Tim Duncan and Manu Ginobili, simply because, you know, 4 seasons together. It's worth noting Tim Duncan has all 5 of the Spurs championships in NBA history, and in 03, this is the only championship that David Robinson, who was washed up at the time, Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker, and of course Tim Duncan played together. So, but Tim Duncan and Manu Ginobili, 4 championships together, many All-Star appearances, one of the better defensive duos on this list. Manu Ginobili, one of the best six men of all time. Tim Duncan, like I said, I'm going to make a video on it, but I think he's the best big man of all time. One of the more underrated players of all time in the 2010s. I believe he was the best player. during that decade. We're talking about a guy who was, he was one of those one man army, teams, with competent role players around him that won a championship back in 03. Okay, people forget this guy used to give Shaq and Kobe the business, but him and Manu Ginobili, I mean, along with Pop, this is one of the better duos of all time, and that's why they come in at number 7. Coming in at number 6, you got Magic Johnson and James Worthy. Both of these guys 6'9", at pretty much the same size, but played 2 totally different positions. I think one of the reasons why the Lakers were so successful is because they had the tallest point guard, not only at the time, but at that time in NBA history. Of course, Ben Simmons has surpassed that at 6'10", but both of these guys, 15 All-Star appearances between each other. You got 3 NBA championships in 85, 87, and 88. Pretty much defined, the 80s Showtime Lakers. James Worthy was a huge part of that. James Worthy is one of the more, he's kind of, I wouldn't say forgotten, but he's not given enough credit. He did win a Finals MVP, and I believe it was 87, 3 All-NBA teams. So James Worthy, he would have been successful without Magic. Maybe not have won rings, but he would have been successful. Magic Johnson did win 2 championships without Worthy, so that's why, they're at number 6, but together they were a force, and that's why they're at number 6. Coming in at number 5, you got Larry Bird and Kevin McHale, one of the better 1-2 punches of all time. 3 championships together, over 20 All-NBA teams together. Larry Bird, of course, a 3-time MVP, 3-time back-to-back MVP, 84, 85, and 86. And you got Kevin McHale, won the 6th Man of the Year in 84, 85. So you got so at one point in the 80s, when playing the Celtics, you had an MVP caliber player starting the game, and then you had the 6th Man of the Year coming in when that guy got tired. So I mean like Manu and Tim Duncan in that regard, but just one of the better all-time duos. And you got Kevin McHale, a guy 6'10", with a 7'7" wingspan, and arguably probably the most skilled low post player of all time. Like I said, the guy once averaged 26 a game. So both of them great in their own rights, but together just an absolute force. I do feel like they would have won more championships together if they played in any other era, but in this era you had the Detroit Bad Boy Pistons in the late 80s, and of course the Showtime Lakers all through the 80s. So Larry Bird and Kevin McHale coming in at number 5. At number 4, we're going back to Showtime here with Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. These guys won 5 titles together. Of course, they're not as high because Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was in the second half of his career by the time Magic arrived. He was already in his 30s, but still very effective. He averaged 20 points for 7 seasons while playing with Magic. Of course, the all-time scoring leader, got Magic Johnson. They have too many to count as far as all NBA selections playing together. But they're not as iconic as Stockton and Malone, because they did have, they were a super team throughout the 80s. But nonetheless, these two, one of the better 1-2 punches in NBA history. At one point, I think you can say they had the best point guard and the best center in the league. And arguably, they're one of those duos that you can say that they would have won more championships if they played in any other era. So they played in the era with, of course, the Boston Celtics and Detroit Pistons in the late 80s. So that was a tough era to play in, but they were able to get 5 championships in that era, and that's why they're at number 4. As we get on into the top 3, these were by far the most difficult to rank, but I'm sure that I ranked them correctly. But at number 3, we've got Tim Duncan and Tony Parker. Now, Tim Duncan and Tony Parker, this is by, some may hear this and think, well, what the hell is going on here? But all you have to do is look at the accolades. 20 All-Star appearances together, 21 All-NBA teams together, 4 NBA championships, and just one of the more underrated and just underappreciated duos of all time. And I think it's because of the Spurs and the Spurs culture. Obviously you got Pop there, but you know, if this was happening in LA, you guys would take more notice. Okay, but Tim Duncan and Tony Parker were, I mean, one of the most unstoppable pick and rolls of all time. But you know, while they can't claim that, you know, they had the best power forward or best big and best point guard, because I don't believe Tony Parker was ever the best point guard in the league. Maybe for a stretch, you know, in like the late, you know, the early 2010s, he was probably the best point guard in the league. But at that point, I don't think Tim Duncan was the best big in the league. But like I said, just one of the more underappreciated duos of all time. You talk about, you know, beating Shaq and Kobe in 03. Tony Parker wasn't a star at that point, but he was a good point guard. Tony Parker, he won the Finals MVP, I believe, in 2007. So Tony Parker is probably going to get lost in history amongst the best point guards of all time, but he is top 5. That's right, I said it. He's a top 5 point guard of all time. Just look at the numbers and the accolades. But Tony Parker and Tim Duncan, of course, you know, Manu Ginobili was lower on this list, but Tony Parker, as much as we like Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker was better. Okay, so yeah, Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, number 3, and they deserve it. Before we mention both 2 and 1, it's worth noting I could have went 1A and 1B with this, but when you go off the criteria, if you remember, longevity, accolades, and talent, I think that competent NBA fans would arrive at the same conclusion. This is going to make a lot of old heads mad, but coming in at number 2, we've got Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. When you talk about the combination of two-way wings, it's probably the most successful when you talk about how to build a championship team. We've seen that try to be replicated with LeBron and D Wade, and now with Kawhi and Paul George. So and Jordan and Pippen were the perfect example of that. I mean, they dominated the 90s. You had one guy who, of course, was more offense than defense, but he was a defensive player of the year at one point, in Michael Jordan. You know, some people say he's the best defender of all time. It's not true, but he's, you know, he is one of the best defenders of all time, not the best. Scottie Pippen, I give the edge to him as a defender because that's his specialty. That he defended the best player on the opposing team. And you know, and some argue that, and this is true, Jordan wouldn't have made it as long as he wouldn't have lasted to 35 at such a high level if it wasn't for Scottie coming in and you know, guarding the best player. Because Jordan, if you remember, from 84 to the point Scottie became an all-star, I mean, he did a lot of heavy lifting. So Scottie definitely eased that burden. Of course, they won everything together. You know, all their championships they won together. Of course, you know, 6 for 6. All Scottie's NBA teams he won while he was with Jordan, all except one, the 95 season when Jordan took a break. So, you know, even Jordan mentioned it himself. You know, you can't say Michael Jordan without Scottie Pippen. So, you know, I mean, just probably not the most iconic duo. You know, I think Jordan, of course, was the superstar. But like I said, he knows he couldn't have done it without Scottie, and we all know that. Coming in at number 1, drum roll please, Kobe and Shaq. Yep, Kobe and Shaq. You may wonder why they're over Jordan and Pippen and all the other duos, even though they only have 3 rings. You know, they're the only duo on this list that you really don't know who's the better player. Now, maybe all time you can argue Kobe, you can argue Shaq. Even all time, you really can't say definitively who is the better player. Now, of course, at that time, Shaq won all the Finals MVPs, but you look at the numbers. I mean, it was both of them damn near averaging 30, with Derek Fisher next up with like 10 points. Okay, so that's why they're so high up on the list. They didn't have, you know, a Rodman with Tony Parker and Ginobili. You know, they had with Tony Parker and Tim Duncan, they had Ginobili. You know, it was more of a trio. You know, the Lakers, it was more of a trio: Worthy, Kareem, and Magic. You know, even though Kareem and Magic won 2 rings without Worthy, but you know, for the most part, Shaq and Kobe, that was it. Okay, there wasn't anyone close to being a third star. And like I said, you don't know. We don't know which one was better. Okay, it was up in the air, and at that time, it was first best player versus second best player. And Shaq from 2000 to 2002, he was the most dominant force of all time. Okay, there was nobody stopping Shaq in 01. Okay, if you remember correctly, I mean, just watch the highlights. Watch the highlights of what he would do. He would do that to any big man in history. Okay, so that's why they're so high up on the list. I mean, they were so great. I mean, they were too good for their own good. Okay, one thing that's to remember about these other duos is that there was a clear leader. Okay, Jordan was clearly better than Pippen. Okay, Tim Duncan was clearly better than Parker. Bird was clearly better than McHale. Magic was better than both Worthy and Kareem, you know, at that point in his career. But Shaq and Kobe, you know, they were right there, neck and neck. They were both 1 and 2, first and second best player in the league, you know, at least for one of those seasons. You know, so I would argue Duncan. You know, if you know me, you know how I feel about Tim Duncan. But you know, I mean, definitely Shaq and Kobe were too good for their own good, and that's part of why they split up. But that's why they're number one. And like I said, if you check off everything, check off all the boxes, make sure you take a good look at longevity. They played 8 seasons together. Take a look at accolades. Okay. All right. Take a look at talent. They were both in their absolute primes, their peak games. Okay. I know, like, people like to say, you know, Kobe, maybe his 35-point season, but I'm talking about Kobe, 22, 23-year-old Kobe was no joke. Okay. And of course, Shaq, the most unstoppable force from 2000 to 2002. Okay, and that's why they're at the top of this list, and that's why they are the best duo of all time. I think you put them, you know, those two by themselves I'm not talking about the Lakers, okay, because I don't believe that those Lakers teams were one of the best teams of all time. Okay, but if you just take those two versus any other duo, I'm taking those two. Okay, but Shaq and Kobe number one. RIP Kobe, by the way. The ranking on this list has nothing to do with Kobe's passing. You know, it's just simply longevity, accolades, and talent. Okay, and that's why they're number one. If you made it to the end, go ahead and drop RIP Kobe in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, as well as hitting the notification bell. Helps out a great deal. Helps out more than you know. I'll be coming with an all-time trio list. I mean, be waiting on that. That'll be dropping pretty soon. All-time trio list. Okay, Tricon. Till next time.